No nanny lasted a week with the triplets until the new nanny did the impossible. No nanny ever lasted more than a week in the Carter household. Daniel Carter, a 38-year-old software architect, stood silently at the front door of his suburban Seattle home, watching as the 15th nanny in 2 years fled in tears, dragging a half-open suitcase behind her. He let out a weary sigh, that familiar sense of helplessness rising in his chest again. His triplets, Lily, Chris, and Ethan, were only 4 years old, but they had managed to break the spirit of every caregiver that came through their door. Behind him, the living room bore the scars of yet another battle. Pillows strewn across the floor, books ripped in half, crayon marks smeared all over the once white walls. "I'm sorry, I just can't do this anymore," the nanny sobbed as she rushed down the driveway. "These kids? They're not normal." Daniel didn't blame her. Honestly, he wasn't sure if he was still normal either, not after 2 years of trying to hold it all together alone since the sudden passing of his wife, Emily. In the kitchen, Grace Miller, the family's 32-year-old cook, paused mid-chop when the sounds of crying and chaos echoed through the house. She washed her hands, untied her apron, and stepped out of the kitchen as if crossing some invisible line. In the living room, Lily was lying face down on the floor, screaming. Chris was pounding his fists into the sofa, while Ethan curled up in the corner, clutching his worn-out teddy bear. Daniel knelt, trying to soothe them, but his voice trembled from exhaustion. "I want Mommy," Lily screamed. "She's not coming back," Chris snapped, eyes burning with anger. Ethan said nothing, silent tears rolling down his cheeks. Grace stood at the doorway, watching. She didn't see misbehaved children. She saw grief. And in that moment, she made a decision no one else in the house had ever dared to make. She stepped into the storm, straight toward their broken little hearts. Grace didn't ask permission. She simply walked into the chaos. Daniel was on his knees, picking up the broken pieces of a glass vase Lily had just hurled to the floor. He turned at the sound of the door opening. Grace entered the living room, not in a rush, not panicked. Her steps were slow, her expression calm, as if the room wasn't filled with screaming, but with nothing more than a lazy afternoon. She said nothing. She knelt down, placed her hands gently on her knees, sat straight, and began to sing. Not a modern children's tune, but an old lullaby, low and warm, the kind her grandmother used to sing to her back in the quiet nights of a small-town childhood. Little pony dreams of skies so wide, in fields of green where Mama sings beside. Lily looked up first, tears still fresh on her cheeks. Chris stopped pounding the couch. Ethan lifted his face from his old teddy bear, listening. There was no magic in the melody. But something in Grace's voice, the steadiness, the quiet strength, reached into the storm swirling inside those 3 little hearts and calmed it, gently. "Who are you?" Chris asked, his voice still trembling. Grace smiled. "I'm Grace. I make the chicken soup you like, and I think I might be burning lunch right now." Lily sniffed the air, squinting. "I smell something burnt." Grace stood and extended her hands. "Want to help me save the meal?" None of them answered, but when Grace turned and walked toward the kitchen, all 3 silently followed her. Daniel stood frozen, barely believing what he was seeing. Inside the sunlit kitchen, Grace pulled 3 chairs close to the island counter and pointed to 3 wooden spoons. "Ethan, you get to stir the soup, but only after I show you how, because it's hot. Chris, you can mix the salad. And Lily, want to help me cut the tomatoes?" "I don't know how," Lily mumbled. "I'll teach you. But first, let's learn how to hold the knife safely." Every action was slow, thoughtful, every task wrapped in encouragement and guidance. Within minutes, the triplets were busy, focused, transformed. Daniel leaned against the doorway in awe. 15 nannies hadn't managed to hold their attention for more than 5 minutes. And now, they were making salad. When Grace passed by him to fetch some herbs, he whispered, How did you do that?" Grace smiled softly. Children need to be included, not just instructed. They want to feel helpful. When we believe in them, they start to believe in themselves. But they could get hurt in the kitchen? They could get hurt anywhere if no one's watching. The difference is, here they're learning something good. Daniel said nothing. Her words settled in the air between them, heavier than they sounded. Grace returned with a bundle of fresh basil and went back to work, not just on lunch, but on something far deeper, something that, without anyone realizing, was already starting to change everything. The next morning, when Daniel came downstairs, he was surprised to find the breakfast table untouched. No laughter, no screaming, just silence. The triplets sat quietly, arms crossed, their faces serious and distant. Grace was in the kitchen preparing breakfast as usual. The smell of fresh toast filled the house, but none of the children touched their plates. "What's going on?" Daniel asked, glancing at the clock. He had a Zoom meeting in less than an hour. "We don't want to eat," Lily said, looking straight at him. "Why not?" He frowned. "Because Miss Grace isn't eating with us," Chris replied firmly. "She's working," Daniel said, trying to stay calm. "Grown-ups have to work." "The nannies used to eat with us," Ethan murmured. "Grace isn't a nanny," Daniel replied. "Then we're not hungry anymore," Lily said, pushing her plate away. Chris and Ethan followed. Daniel closed his eyes and sighed. "Grace," he called toward the kitchen. Grace walked out, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression as calm as ever. "They're making a fuss. Can you get them to eat?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out the empty chair and sat at the table. "Good morning, little ones," she said gently. "Did you dream anything nice last night?" "I dreamed Mom was making cookies," Lily said, her voice cracking. "I don't remember," Chris whispered, "but I woke up feeling sad." Ethan kept his head down. "I just remembered Teddy, and I missed Mommy." Grace didn't speak right away. She poured herself a glass of milk and picked up a piece of toast. Quiet, normal, no pleading, no bargaining. "You know," she said, chewing the second bite, "when I was little and felt sad, my grandma used to teach me how to make bread. She said kneading dough is like kneading your heart. The more love you put in, the softer it gets." Lily tilted her head. "You know how to make bread?" "Of course I do. I can teach you next time." The three children looked at each other. Slowly, they reached for their plates. No one said a word, but the toast disappeared bite by bite. Daniel stood against the wall, his chest tightening. When was the last time he'd eaten breakfast with his kids? Since Emily passed, he'd buried himself in work. Meanwhile, the children were drifting farther from him every day. Grace wasn't just feeding them, she was bringing them back, to life, to each other, with nothing but patience, presence, and small, ordinary magic. Logic told Daniel he couldn't rely on a cook to raise his children, no matter how good she was. So once again, he called 3 different nanny agencies in one afternoon. Less than 24 hours later, a new candidate arrived at the Carter residence, Miss Claudia Bauer. She was in her mid-40s, blonde hair pulled tightly into a low bun, dressed in a beige suit and carrying a thick portfolio. Her handshake was firm enough to make Daniel sit up straighter. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. I'm originally from Berlin. I've worked for diplomatic families across Europe. I'm fluent in 3 languages and hold a Montessori teaching degree. My approach is structured, disciplined, and built on healthy boundaries." Daniel nodded politely, impressed by the credentials. Claudia scanned the home, especially the children, who were coloring at the kitchen table under Grace's calm supervision. "Children need to know who's in charge," she said firmly. "Too much softness leads to behavioral instability." Daniel didn't disagree. After all, Grace was still just the cook, wasn't she? From upstairs, the triplets watched Claudia closely from behind the railing. "She looks like the witch from Snow White," Lily whispered. "Let's make her leave," Chris said, eyes gleaming with mischief. "How?" Ethan asked, still unsure. "The way we always do," Lily smirked. When Claudia climbed the stairs to evaluate the children's sleeping and recreational spaces, the triplets were ready. "Very tidy," she remarked upon entering their room. "Good, but from now on, you'll tidy yourselves. Children must learn personal responsibility." "Miss Grace cleaned it this morning," Ethan said without thinking. "Not anymore. You'll do your own chores." "Would you like to see our favorite toys?" Lily offered sweetly, suspiciously so. Claudia nodded. "Show me." Lily opened the toy chest and began tossing everything onto the floor. Chris joined in, dumping an entire tub of Legos. Ethan hesitated, then knocked a few books off the shelf. In under 2 minutes, the room looked like a hurricane had hit it. "Stop that right now," Claudia snapped. "You do not behave like this when an adult is speaking." The children ignored her. They began jumping on the beds, screaming in delight. Daniel, hearing the noise, rushed upstairs. What he saw stunned him. Claudia, red-faced with fury, while the triplets hung from the curtains like little monkeys in a circus. "Mr. Carter," she gasped, "I'm leaving. There is no amount of money that would make this job worth it." She gathered her things and left the house within 3 minutes. The triplets climbed down and faced their father. "Why did you do that?" he asked, exhausted. "She doesn't know how to play," Chris said simply. "She doesn't know how to make cookies," Lily added. "And she can't do the volcano," Ethan said, eyes wide with honesty. Daniel made his way to the kitchen, where Grace was preparing beef stew. The rich aroma filled the house. "The nanny quit," he announced, collapsing into a chair. "I figured," Grace said, not looking up. "I heard everything. I don't know what to do with them anymore. They're different." Grace turned, met his eyes. "They're not bad, Daniel. They're angry and scared." "Scared of what?" "They're scared you'll disappear too." After the 16th nanny incident, Daniel stopped calling agencies altogether. He didn't mention hiring anyone else. He simply told Grace, "Let's leave things as they are," for a few days. But a few days turned into weeks, and in those weeks, Grace quietly became the heart of the house. Each morning, she woke the kids not with alarms, but with soft singing. She sat with them for breakfast, never scolding if someone spilled milk or fought over the red spoon. She didn't teach with commands. She taught by example. "You didn't yell when I spilled the water," Lily noted one morning. "Because everyone makes mistakes," Grace smiled. "We just wipe it up and try again." She did everything with them, planting carrots in the backyard, baking apple-stuffed cookies, turning plastic bottles into tiny flower pots. When Chris asked, "Why doesn't the sun fall down?" she didn't brush it off. She grabbed a ball and a string and started teaching gravity in the simplest way a 4-year-old could understand. The kids began learning big things through small moments, and more than anything, they learned how to listen, to share, and to love. Daniel noticed it first. One evening, when he came home late, he saw the triplets lined up, handing Grace scribbled drawings. Each paper had a heart and clumsy letters spelling, "Thank you, Miss Grace." "What's all this?" Daniel asked. "We made thank you cards," Ethan said, "because she doesn't yell like the other ladies. And she knows how to bake and do volcanoes and tell scary stories without getting scared," Chris added. "And she didn't leave," Lily whispered. Daniel looked at Grace, her silver-streaked hair, her hands still dusted in flour, and something in his chest sank. He had once thought of her as just the cook, a cog in the household machine. But now he saw clearly. She was the soul of this family. One afternoon, Daniel shut his laptop earlier than usual. He walked outside to find Grace on the lawn, reading fairy tales to the kids. All three sat close, tucked in like baby birds in a nest. He watched from the steps. It had been so long since he'd seen his children smile like that. Not forced smiles from following some program, but real ones, because they felt safe, because they felt loved. After story time, Grace led the trio into the kitchen to wash their hands and bake chocolate chip muffins. Each child had a task. Lily cracked the eggs, Ethan sprinkled the nuts, and Chris watched the oven like a hawk. Daniel stepped in. "Can I help?" "Of course," Grace grinned, "but you'll need an apron." And for the first time in 2 years, the Carter kitchen echoed with the laughter of all four of them. When the kids were asleep, Daniel helped Grace with the dishes. "Did you ever think this would be your life?" he asked, unsure of his own question. Grace paused. "I used to think I was just the cook. But those kids, they showed me I could be someone who makes a home." Daniel looked at her, really looked, not just as the cook or the caregiver, but as the woman who had quietly rebuilt his children's world and gently stitched his back together, too. One late winter evening, after the kids had gone to bed and the house glowed with soft golden light, Daniel and Grace sat in the kitchen, sharing a cup of tea in quiet. Neither said much, but the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comforting, the kind that grows between two people who've carried something heavy together. Daniel looked out the window, where snow had begun to fall in lazy flakes, then turned to Grace. "I don't know what the kids would have done without you," he said quietly. "Honestly?" Grace didn't reply right away. She offered a small, tired smile, eyes filled with exhaustion and gratitude. They just needed someone who stayed. And just when Daniel thought things were finally falling into place, the kids laughing again, life finding its way back to center, the doorbell rang the next morning. Carried in with a cold breeze and a quiet storm, the woman Daniel called Mom crossed the threshold, with a stare sharp enough to slice through steel. That morning, as Grace was baking cinnamon bread for breakfast, the doorbell rang. Daniel opened it, and there stood someone he hadn't expected just yet. Margaret Carter, his mother. Hair pulled into a perfect bun, gray trench coat, designer handbag, and eyes sharp as ever. No hug, no smile, no warm greeting. Just a nod and a short sentence. "Seattle's colder than the last time I visited." Daniel hesitated. "I thought you were still in New York." "Something came up. I'm here to check on the children and the parenting choices you're making." Grace stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter. I'm Grace." Margaret didn't shake hands. Her gaze flicked over Grace's simple clothes, tied back hair, and flour-dusted hands, as if judging a wrinkled shirt. "You're the housekeeper?" "I cook and currently care for the children." "Oh," Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Didn't realize baking qualified one to replace proper educational credentials." The air in the house turned noticeably colder. The triplets were still playing with Legos in the living room, unaware that a storm was brewing. That evening, once the children were asleep, Margaret sat across from Daniel in the study. "You're not serious, Daniel. Children don't need cupcakes and gardening. They need structure. They need rules. They need trained professionals." "You weren't here for the last 2 years, Mom," Daniel said evenly. "Grace has done more than any credential ever could." "Exactly why I came. To fix that." Daniel leaned back, tired. "What do you want to do?" "I called Claudia Bauer. She's agreed to return. This time, with my authority and full support, she'll succeed." Daniel wanted to argue, but he just sighed. "I don't want a war." "It's already a war," Margaret replied. "You just don't want to admit it." 2 days later, Claudia arrived again, this time armed with detailed schedules, a reward box, a discipline box, and a wall full of early development charts plastered across the living room. The kids curled inward like wet kittens. No laughter, no questions about Grace. But Daniel noticed the life had quietly drained from the house. Lily chewed her nails. Chris stared blankly out the window. Ethan clutched Teddy and didn't say a word. Grace kept cooking, kept cleaning, but she wasn't allowed to play, to teach, to tell stories. She was just the help, just as Margaret wanted. By day 3, Daniel had had enough. He passed the living room and found Lily crouched beneath the table, tears silently falling. "I'm fine," she whispered. "I'm just waiting for school to end." Daniel walked into the kitchen where Grace was loading the dishwasher. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Grace smiled without looking up. "As long as the kids need me, I'll stay, even if it's just as the cook." Daniel nodded and turned to leave, but Grace added, "But if you ever decide there's no room left for love in this house, let me know so I won't bring it to the dinner table anymore." That night, Margaret held a glass of wine, standing by the study window. "Grace should go back to her place," she said. "And you should remember, Carter is a name that carries weight. We don't let emotion override order." Daniel said nothing. He looked down at his desk, where a crumpled drawing from Ethan lay, scribbled in shaky letters. "I love Miss Grace." And for the first time, Daniel began to wonder. Maybe it was the idea of order that had been tearing his family apart all along. Ethan's scribbled drawing still echoed in Daniel's mind the next morning as he walked into the kitchen. "I love Miss Grace. Not teacher, not nanny, just Miss Grace, someone familiar, safe, and deeply loved." Grace was by the sink, prepping breakfast. The sun hadn't fully risen, but she was already moving, like every morning. Daniel turned to leave, then paused. Under the soft kitchen light, he saw the dark circles under her eyes and the slight hunch in her shoulders. "You didn't sleep enough?" he asked softly. Grace jumped slightly, then offered a tired smile. "I got up a bit earlier, needed time to bake and prep a few things for the kids." "What kind of things?" She hesitated, then gestured toward the table. A few new books, a box of crayons, and a solar system model still in its packaging. "I took a night shift washing dishes at a diner nearby," she murmured. "It's not much, but it paid for these. The kids love learning when they don't know they're learning. So, I find ways." Daniel said nothing. He looked at the supplies, then back at the woman in front of him, someone doing this not out of obligation, but out of love for 3 children who weren't even hers. That evening, when Margaret brought up hiring a tutor, Daniel interrupted her. "Mom, I've made up my mind," he said, calmly but firmly. "About what?" "Grace is staying, not as a temporary help, as their primary caregiver." Margaret's brows furrowed. "Daniel." "She understands them, loves them, and helps them grow, in ways no one else ever did. She's a cook, not an educator. She's who my kids need, and honestly, I think I need her too." For the first time, Margaret had no immediate response. The next morning, Daniel asked Grace to meet him in the backyard, where the kids were playing in the dirt, inspecting their tiny carrot sprouts. "Grace," he began, "from today, you're no longer just standing on the sidelines." She looked at him, confused. "I want to officially make you the children's caregiver, not just emotionally, but legally and professionally. I've adjusted your salary, added full benefits, and if needed, we'll hire someone to assist you in the kitchen." Grace froze. "Why would you do all this for me?" Daniel met her eyes, voice low. "Because I know you've been sacrificing sleep, your health, and your time just to see the kids smile again. From now on, you don't have to work nights anymore." He pulled out a small envelope, revealing a new bank card in her name. "I'll take care of everything. All I ask is that you keep doing what you do best, loving these kids with your whole heart." Grace held the card tightly, eyes glistening. For the first time in years, she no longer felt temporary, no longer alone. In the morning light, Lily ran up and hugged her leg. "Miss Grace, can we do the volcano today?" Grace smiled, tears slipping down her cheek. "Of course, sweetheart, and this time, Mr. Daniel's helping too." One quiet weekend morning, while Daniel and the kids were outside playing ball, Grace stayed behind to tidy up the kitchen. Margaret entered, placing her tea on the counter, and spoke, her voice softer than usual. "You love those children deeply. I can see that." Grace paused, looking up. For the first time, Margaret's gaze wasn't cold. "But," she continued, "have you ever thought, when they grow up, go to school, make friends, build their own lives, where will you be in their world?" Grace didn't answer. Margaret tilted her head slightly, offering a faint smile. "No one remembers who baked them cookies as a child, Grace. They remember the people who led them somewhere meaningful. Your place in their life may not be as lasting as you think." The words lingered all day. That night, after the children were asleep, Grace sat alone, surrounded by crayon drawings taped to her wall. Her heart swelled and ached. 2 days later, while Daniel took Ethan to a doctor's appointment, Grace quietly submitted a job application to a nearby preschool. A stable job, a professional setting, a real career path, one with clarity and boundaries. "We're very impressed with your profile," the principal said. "Your hands-on experience is incredibly valuable." On the bus ride home, Grace stared out the window. The city blurred by slowly. She thought of the kids, probably waiting for her to tell them their bedtime story. She thought of dinner, of the dessert she hadn't baked, of Lily's giggle, Chris's endless questions, and Ethan's bedtime hugs. "When the kids grow up, where will you be in their world?" Margaret's words echoed again. Grace clenched her hands in her lap. That question wasn't easy to answer. One path was safe. The other held 3 tiny hearts loving her with everything they had. And for the first time in a long while, Grace wondered, was she giving up her future for something that may never truly be hers? Grace was ready for the interview. Her folder sat neatly in her bag. Her shirt was crisp, her hair tied back. But her heart felt heavy. That morning, the kids had hugged her tight, and Ethan had whispered, "You're not leaving us, right?" The question stayed with her. As she stepped out onto the porch, Daniel was already there, waiting. Without a word, he handed her a warm cup of tea and sat beside her on the old wooden bench. "You can still chase your dream," he said softly, "without leaving behind what makes you happy." Grace looked at him, uncertain. He continued, "There are weekend classes at Seattle University, early childhood education. I checked. You could study and still be here, with them." Grace sat quietly for a long moment. Then she exhaled, slow, deep. She went back inside, opened her bag, pulled out the job application, and tore it in half. A week later, Grace enrolled in weekend courses for early childhood education. She still woke up early every morning, still baked, still told fairy tales, still answered the kids' endless questions with quiet, unwavering love. From that day on, no one called her the help anymore. To the kids, she was their teacher, their home, their heart. And Daniel? He changed too. He no longer missed dinner. He started walking Chris to school, helping Lily with her homework, and reading bedtime stories to Ethan. His presence was no longer a blur. It was becoming a memory, something real and steady. And slowly, day by day, a new family was reborn, not from blood, but through love, understanding, and choices made with the heart. One early spring evening, Daniel walked into the kitchen holding a letter, his face a mix of excitement and nervousness. Grace was baking sugar cookies while the kids doodled wildly at the table. "I have news," Daniel said, placing the envelope on the counter. "What is it?" Grace asked, wiping her hands on her apron. The company offered me a position in Austin, Texas, creative director. Grace paused. The kids stopped drawing. The kitchen went oddly quiet. So, you're moving? She asked softly. Yes, and... Daniel hesitated. I want you to come with me. Grace looked uncertain. She turned to the kids, their wide eyes fixed on her, anxious, afraid. She didn't answer. She simply smiled faintly and turned back to the oven. That night, as she tucked the kids in, Lily sat up suddenly. If you don't come, we'll sneak back to Seattle, she pouted. You're our home, Chris added, his voice trembling. Ethan tugged on her hand. You said we were a family, and families don't leave each other, right? Grace wrapped them in her arms. In that moment, all her doubts dissolved. The next morning, she handed Daniel a hot cup of coffee. Is your offer from last night still open? She asked. Daniel nodded. Always? Grace smiled. Then, tell the kids we're starting over. Together. 2 months later, they left Seattle. The old house was locked up, but no one felt like they were leaving anything behind, because what mattered most was moving forward together. In Austin, Daniel began his new job. Grace enrolled in weekend education courses and started a small neighborhood learning group for local children. Lily, Chris, and Ethan began school nearby, and every afternoon, as they walked through the door, the first thing they shouted was, Miss Grace, we're home. And at dinner, between the giggles, the squabbling over spoons, and messy stories from the day, no one needed to say it aloud, but everyone knew this family was chosen with love. It was an ordinary evening. Grace had cooked the kids' favorite beef stew. Daniel set the table. Lily folded napkins. Chris brought out the bowls, and Ethan hovered around Grace just to smell the stew again to be sure it's real. They gathered at the table, the room filled with laughter, stories, and scattered crumbs. No candles, no flowers, no soft music, just warm kitchen light and the kind of comfort that comes from belonging. After dessert, a perfectly golden apple pie, Daniel put down his fork and looked straight at Grace. Grace, he said, calm and certain. Marry me? The entire table froze. Grace nearly forgot how to breathe. And the kids? For real? Lily shrieked. Does that mean she'll be our real mom now? Chris asked, wide-eyed. Ethan shot up, arms in the air. I say yes for Miss Grace. Grace burst into laughter, her cheeks flushed. She looked at Daniel. He wasn't joking. His eyes were steady, soft, and deeply sincere. You don't have to change a thing, Daniel said. I just want to officially call this what it already is, a family. She looked around the table, at the 3 little faces, the mess, the memories built over 2 years filled with love and tears. We've already been a family, she whispered. Daniel nodded. This just makes it official. Grace slowly nodded back. Then, yes. The kids exploded in cheers, leaping from their chairs, running around the table like fireworks had gone off. And Grace, in the middle of the chaos, the clinking dishes, the lingering smell of stew, gently placed her hand over Daniel's, eyes shimmering. It wasn't a grand proposal. It wasn't planned. But it was a promise that everything they'd built together was never temporary. And as they cleared the dishes that night, hearts still fluttering, laughter echoing, none of them could imagine just how beautiful the years ahead would be. 10 years passed in the blink of an eye. Lily, Chris, and Ethan were now 14, taller than Grace, quick-witted, sharp, and each chasing a dream that had been quietly planted during childhood. Lily pursued art, always carrying her sketchbook and the fairy tales Grace once told. Chris was a junior inventor, obsessed with models, machines, and anything he could take apart and rebuild. And Ethan, once the quietest, was now the voice of his school's radio station, sharing Grace's tenderness with the world, one word at a time. The old house had become a home-based preschool, Little Roots, founded and led by Grace. With her warm heart and lived experience, she didn't just teach children, she mentored young educators and became a beacon of inspiration in the Austin community. But the most surprising change of all? Margaret. Once Grace's biggest critic, she had become her strongest supporter. She now visited Little Roots, often reading stories to the little ones and openly admitting, "Grace taught me how to love by listening." One summer night, after the kids were asleep, Daniel and Grace sat together on the porch beneath a sky full of stars. The soft hum of crickets filled the air like a lullaby. Daniel held her hand gently. "Do you ever think all of this used to feel impossible?" he asked. Grace tilted her head, smiling. "I do, but love made the impossible possible." They didn't say much after that. And like all the best stories, they didn't live happily ever after. They lived happily, one day at a time, together. Because sometimes the most beautiful families aren't born. They're built piece by piece through ordinary days filled with extraordinary love.